just the first point I'd like to make is that, austerity is how far it's fallen off the agenda, in a sense. It's been the driving thing for the last 6 years. The Tories the coalition Tories said they'd eliminate it by 2015. Labour said they'd halve it. The Tories actually managed to halve it. And now we've seen the time of getting the books balanced drift slowly out. And now it's all the way out to 2025 in the Conservative manifesto. And with that, as pointed out on the Conservative side, there's more room for manoeuvre to raise tax. How do you balance the books? You cut spending or you raise tax or you increase borrowing. It's clear the tax burden is going to rise after the election anyway. If they really want to do some of the things they say they want to do, this applies to all three parties, but also the Conservatives, strikes me taxes are going to have to go up, or we end up running a very long deficit, which includes increasing our debt, which leaves bugger all room for manoeuvre if something else really goes wrong out there, which could include Brexit. So I think there's been a big shift in the austerity thing. It's not driving it in the same way. I'll do health in two bits. One, first of all, simply to say, well, they're all signed up to the principle of an NHS free at the point of use and no provision for new charges. That's not been true at every election in the past, so that's common ground. And there's the promise of more money, but you can't work out from the manifestos quite who's promising more or what because the numbers aren't clear. More money, but I suspect most people in NHS will say still not enough money, which brings us around to the question of social care. Social care bit is extraordinary in the sense that the Conservatives didn't have to say anything about it. They'd already promised a green paper for September, and they could have said, we're going to have a green paper on social care. And they have, in theory, another policy sitting on the shelf, which was Dilnot, which had been postponed to 2020. I mean, it looked to me like it had been canned, but technically it had only been postponed. Why did they have to get into this territory? And when they got into it, why did they have to get into it in the way they have done? Which has clearly had a lot of bad reaction, may appear to have shifted the polls a bit. And now, as of yesterday, it appears we're back into something that might recognisably be Dilnot territory again. We're going to have a cap on the upper end. Quite where it will fall and what it will involve is unclear. And it's interesting that even if you have that, there's a kind of a second, that there are two problems, two issues in social care. One is who pays. And Dilnot is really all about who pays and how people can protect themselves. It's not necessarily about pumping more money into publicly funded social care services. In other words, running social care will cost the government more because it will be protecting more of people's assets and savings, but that in itself does not increase the level of provision. And if you look at what's happening within the NHS and the lack of social care provision, that clearly has a knock-on effect. So you can have a debate about how far you protect people from the bills of this, but what that doesn't do is necessarily drive more service. And what's been happening in social care is the number of people getting help has been shrinking and the quantity of help has tended to shrink. There's kind of 4 grades of social care: critical, severe, moderate, and I can't remember what the other is. Nobody gets the other mild. Almost nobody gets moderate. More and more local authorities are only helping people with critical needs. So you can do something about who pays for it, but that doesn't necessarily massively increase the level of provision, which has its own knock-on effect to the NHS. And just one other thing, back to health. There's an intriguing bit in the manifesto where it says, if the current legislative landscape for the NHS is either slowing implementation or preventing clear national or local accountability, we will consult and make the necessary legislative changes. This includes the NHS's own internal market, which can fail to act in the interests of patients and creates costly bureaucracy. Now, I think that's quite remarkable. Back in the 60th anniversary of NHS, Kenneth Clarke, who introduced the purchaser-provider split, said if one day it turns out that we can't make commissioning work, then we've been barking up the wrong tree for the last 20 years. Well, that kind of begins to say precisely that. It's not that commissioning is going to disappear entirely, but the purchaser-provider split and the emphasis on choice and competition, which was a huge, what effect it had is debatable. It was a huge policy driver in the Labour years. Lansley's white paper was seen to be all about that. More private providers, more choice, more private providers, more choice and competition, and it's all fallen out of the lexicon. In Lansley's white paper, the word choice, patient choice in various forms, appears 39 times. And in Simon Stevens' 5-year forward view, it appears 7 times, and it's mainly around, choice of what sort of treatment you get, not necessarily where you get it. Word competition's in the white paper 7 times. It doesn't appear at all in Lansley's 5-year forward view. and it's just sort of dropping out. So we're kind of watching 25 years of policy, if not being turned on its head, at least dissolving before our eyes. And indeed, I've been slightly surprised, given the pressure the NHS is clearly under, how little large public discussion there has been about changing the funding system. And by that, I don't mean necessarily having a hypothecated health tax. I mean changing the funding system so that people pay more towards healthcare in one way or another. And there's not really been that. We haven't reached that stage of that debate. It hasn't really happened. And there have been plenty of times in the past when that debate has been around. I remember that being in the middle of the 1990s. That was huge. Which is the last time the NHS was under the sorts of pressures we're seeing it under now. But it's not really been there. There's the sort of thing we have to think about this, and it all looks rather difficult. We need to consider it. But there's not really been a set of concrete policy proposals knocking around all over the place about changing it. What is it that makes Britain British? And the NHS is right up there on the pedestal. I mean, if you look at the NHS as one giant insurance scheme, really, big national insurance scheme, it's effectively what it is, funded from general taxation. As Dilnot pointed out, I thought quite sensibly and reasonably, social care costs are about the only big risk in life you can't insure for. And essentially what he was trying to do was create an insurance market. It was interesting, none of the products had appeared by 2015 when it was due to start to come in, and I've never could get a clear answer out the insurance industry why that wasn't why that hadn't happened. The explanation is that they will appear, no one's going to design a product in detail until this actually happens. So if you have a £75,000 cap for the sake of argument, you will then design a product that does that, and those products aren't going to appear until it is actually a reality. The other possibility is they wouldn't design the products.